In the election of 1880, it featured the dark horse Republican candidate James A. Garfield, whose running mate was Chester Arthur. In total, they got 214 electoral votes against the Democratic candidate Winfield Scott Hancock, who only got 115. The third-party candidate, the Greenback Labor Party, featured James B. Weaver, who got no votes. Garfield won the election, but he got shot, which was pretty sad, and Chester Arthur ended up filling in for him. Garfield was killed because of the spoils system. The impact of this was that it created the Pendleton Act, and Chester Arthur reformed the spoils system, a key issue splitting the Republican Party. In the election of 1884, he featured the Democratic candidate Grover Cleveland, who had 219 electoral votes, versus the Republican candidate James G. Blaine, who only had 182. Some Republicans didn't like Blaine, so they ended up changing parties, and they became known as the Mugwumps, who were Republicans who changed the Democratic nominee. Cleveland won, and the significance of this election resulted in Republicans insulting Democrats differently as Rum, Romanism, and Rebellion, which insulted Irish culture, faith, and patriotism of New York, making Irish people not vote for them. Cleveland fought for reduced tariffs. She was a strong advocate of the laissez-faire economics, and he wanted to veto pensions for Civil War veterans. In the election of 1888, it featured Republican candidate Benjamin Harrison, who got 233 electoral votes, versus the Democratic candidate Grover Cleveland, who got 168. Harrison won, and he supported the Dependent Pensions Act, which helped former Union soldiers, and he also became known for the first $1 billion Congress, which gave pensions to Civil War veterans, increased silver, and passed the McKinley Tariff. He also published the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was a complete failure and was unable to distinguish good or bad trusts. In the election of 1892, it featured the Democratic candidate Grover Cleveland, who got 277 electoral votes this time around, versus the Republican or Whig candidate Benjamin Harrison, who only got 145. The populist candidate was James G. Blaine, who didn't really do much. In the end, Cleveland said, "I am back," and he won. And the Panic of 1893 was caused by railroads that led the nation into bankruptcy, and this eventually led to bank failures. J.P. Morgan and other bankers got involved, and the banker at the time dominated competing railroad corporations and formed monopolies. A monopoly is basically when one company controls a certain area of production independently. Customers and small investors were impacted by this greatly, and this eventually led to Congress taking actions against railroad companies in attempts to regulate railroad industries. Due to this, the Granger Laws and Interstate Commerce Acts were passed. The Gospel of Wealth. With businesses prospering, individuals used the Gospel of Wealth and the theory of social Darwinism to defend their wealth. The Gospel of Wealth were individuals using religion to justify the wealth of successful industrialists and bankers. God favors hard work was their slogan. And the face of this was Reverend Russell Conwell, preaching that all individuals should be focused on becoming rich. Another face of this was Andrew Carnegie, who wrote a Gospel of Wealth article saying the wealthy, obtaining society's riches, had to prove themselves morally responsible. Social Darwinism. Social Darwinism was Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection and biology, which influenced social Darwinism, and it was faced by Herbert Spencer. Individuals gained their status by competing on the basis of their natural talents. Essentially, the wealthy were more fit, benefiting society, and helping the poor would weaken the flow of society. New inventions. Inventions led to greater productivity in favorites and a larger variety of mass-produced goods. Samuel F. B. Morse created the telegraph, which provided a much faster way to communicate. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, and Thomas Edison created the light bulb, phonograph, motion picture camera, and mimeograph machine. He also established the world's first modern research laboratory, which greatly benefited science and industries because it introduced the idea of mechanic and engineers working together rather than by themselves. The impact on America at the time. The growth of industries impacted social classes. They created a more defined between the rich, middle class, and poor. Horatio Alger, whose novels spoke about how one could become rich through honesty, hard work, and a little luck. Women were impacted the most by this, as they gained new economic and social opportunities, and they were mostly young and single. They believed the woman's role at home was taking care of the house and children, and they worked mostly in factories. Factories such as textile, garment, and food processing industries. The women earned less than men, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were important members of the women's suffrage movement, as we'll see in the future. Impact on the South. The South didn't focus on reforming like the North. They wanted to focus on Reconstruction still, but they were more focused on Jim Crow laws, which limited the civil rights of African Americans and enforced racial segregation in the South. This was a very negative response from the Populist Party. And they also focused on the Grandfather Clause, which restricted voting rights, mostly for African Americans. And it was basically anyone who could prove their grandfathers had been able to vote in 1860 could essentially vote, which was unfair to African Americans. Immigration. Europeans migrated due to poverty, overpopulation in Europe, and religious freedoms. New versus old immigrants. They settled in major cities. Men were hired in factories, mining, construction companies, and with the money they gained, they would bring it back to their families in their native lands. This caused many tensions, especially the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which banned all immigration from China. Why were so many people afraid against immigrants? Well, they feared that immigrants would steal their jobs, and the American Protective Association were against Roman Catholics. Urbanization in cities. Many young Americans left their farms for more industrial and commercial jobs. African Americans were settling in northern and western cities, and William LeBaron Jenney built the home insurance company building in Chicago, aka the first true real steel skyscraper. The advanced transportation affected urban workers, meaning that workers could easily go to their jobs with subways. The wealthy moved away from crime-known areas, which affected immigrants. Ethnic neighborhoods. These consisted of immigrants and poor Americans, basically the ghetto. They lived in tenement apartments, and immigrants made sure to maintain their culture and language. Boss Tweed. William Boss Tweed in New York. The Tweed ring symbolized the lack of ethics during the Gilded Age. Boss Tweed used bribery in elections to gain money, and he ran the New York Democratic Party. New York Times exposed him, which led to his imprisonment. Tammany Hall. A very powerful New York political machine, drawing support from cities, immigrants, and underprivileged due to them depending on social services. They offer a form of welfare for urban newcomers, and they dominated Democratic Party politics. Patronage. Roscoe Conkling defines patronage, a system in which the political parties granted jobs and favored party regulators who helped them gain votes. This caused great amounts of controversy in the Republican Party, which split the party graft. Education. New laws increased the number of children enrolled in the schools. Literacy rate rose to almost 90%. Emergence of new colleges and universities accepted both genders and African Americans. W.E.B. Du Bois was the first African American to receive a doctorate from Harvard, and he advocated for equal rights, integrated schools, and equal access to higher education for the talented tenth of African Americans. Woman. Temperance. Women believed that male factory workers who drank were to be blamed for the poverty of immigrants and families. Women's Christian Temperance Union was led by Frances E. Willard, and the Anti-Saloon League was a powerful political force persuading shutdown of all saloons and bars. Some questions. How did big business in the Gilded Age impact future domestic policies with business? How did trusts and J.D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company affect the competition, and what did the government do to combat it? And how did the Gilded Age divide the rich and the poor even more? Here's our Kahoot, and here's our picture. Thank you for watching our presentation.